know we're supposed to start in a few minutes, and I want to give anybody who's going to trickle in. I know how that is. I usually show up at a 9:45 meeting at 9:43. So we'll talk a little bit and give people a chance to kind of filter in here over the next few minutes. But thank you so much for, again, spending the morning with me to talk about this. I'm going to share my screen here. Please let me know if for some reason you cannot see it. I'm going to try it. We're going to see. Let me know if you can see it. Thumbs up. Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate that. Let me also make sure I can see my end here. Perfect. All right. Again, thank you so much thank you, Jade. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to just have a very conversational opportunity to just chat here. So I always tell people I do not lecture. I do not, force. I do not engage people in ways that they don't feel comfortable. What I do is I do heart work. And what I mean by heart work is I share from a space of love and pure intention, and hope that by sharing some of my own stories, being candid about some of my experiences, that people can find a way to connect in this work, right? When we talk about racial, adversity, when we talk about oppression, when we talk about white supremacy, some of those things are very hard for people to hear and understand. When we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that too is very hard for some people to understand. And I completely get that. So the goal here is to ensure that we talk, again, from a place of my heart, share with you some of my own personal experiences, and hope that by doing that, you can relate to some of the work that we do, right? So elevating Black women in survivorship and advocacy work is something that's super near and dear to me. I am a survivor of sexual trauma. And so when I think about some of the experiences I went through as a child, when I think about some of the systems, the people, the agencies that supported me, I also think about some of the ones that didn't and what that felt and looked like. And so that's really what this conversation is about.
Stinking butt.
Hit mute.
Oh, God.
When I think about some of this work and kind of what it means, hold on just a second. There we go. When I think about some of this work and what it means, I think about a few different things. I'm going to play. Hopefully this will work. Me and Karen tested it out, but we know how this goes when you're trying to share. I'm going to try to share this video. Uh-oh. What did it do here? Did my presentation go away?
Nope, you're all good. It's here.
Is it good?
Yep,
Awesome.
You can just keep going. You're on the first page of it.
Perfect. Okay. I'm going to try to play this. If for some reason it doesn't play, someone come off mute and just say, hold up, Candice, so I'll know, okay? Let me know if you can't hear it.
It's good.
Wow, right? Every time I see that, I am amazed at the numbers and the reality of what we're dealing with as a nation and a society around Black women in survivorship. I think what's often lost is when we have these conversations around sexual trauma, the voice of Black women is often neglected. And here's why I think that is. When we think about Black women, this quote really resonates with me because it talks about the myth of strength, right? Yes, Black women are strong, but guess why we're strong? It's because we have to be, right? It's because we were neglected, unprotected, and disrespected. So when you think about that previous and why it's so very important for me to elevate our voices in this work, think about those numbers. Those numbers are actually a few years old. As you saw in the last slide, and I think we saw a recent news article break, right? That number around domestic violence, sexual assault, and trauma is very much underreported or not reported at all. So we really don't have a true understanding of what this work means and what it means to be traumatized in this world as women, as trans, as femmes, right? The data isn't there, it doesn't support it. We know it exists. In fact, let me tell you a personal story. I just had a meeting with a few women that I did not know very well. In that meeting, 3 out of our 4 women have been sexually traumatized and assaulted, all Black women. Told stories of being molested as children, told stories of having sexual encounters with adult men, told stories of having been raped, some for many, many years. That was in one room with 4 women. And so where I'm going with this is that this isn't something that's new, but it is something that we need to talk about, and we need to understand how very real it is. We need to also change the narrative around how Black women are seen in this work. And I always use the idea of strong Black women in that narrative because it's something we've all heard, right? Black women are just so strong. In fact, it's something that's been said to me. How are you so strong? And I always tell people, like, I don't know that it's because I don't know that it's because I necessarily want to be. I think it's because it's all I know, right? It's how we're raised, it's how we're expected, it's how we're, made to show up, but it's not healthy. And so I want to talk about that a little bit about how we can possibly change those narratives. And I want to talk to both those that are providing services, those that need to receive the services, and I want to talk to victims and survivors as well. So as we go through this, super informal, again, I'm a conversationalist, I don't like to lecture. So if there are questions or thoughts that you have in this conversation, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Since I'll be kind of maneuvering the slideshow and talking to you, I'll rely on someone else on the call to pause and call out any questions that you may have. But please, as you're thinking about this work, let me know if you do have any questions or thoughts so that we can talk through that a little bit, okay? Let's go and look at some more quotes. And so these are some more data. We're a data-driven society. We don't do anything without research. So I want to throw out a few different recent data that I was able to find just around some of this. And again, we're looking at 2012, 13, 14. Sometimes data is often 5, 6 years old. We can continue to search and dig, but we don't ever really know the accuracy of some of the things that we see. But I can tell you, again, based on my real lived experience and some of the things that I've seen doing this work, that some of these numbers are probably way less than they even should be. So Black women face an unusually high threat of sexual violence and intimate partner homicide is one of the leading causes of death for women between the ages of 15 to 35. I was reading something, there's a site on Facebook called Femicide. I think it's called Black Women, it might be something like femicide or feminine. I can't remember the exact name. If you want it, let me know and I'll send it to you. And it literally details the stories of Black women who are murdered and how often they're murdered by their partners. It tells the stories of the woman, it puts a face to the name. It's devastating to see, but the reason why I make sure I stay in touch with that website is because I want to understand for myself how often this is happening all around me. So the fact that women between the ages of 15 to 35 are dying by the hands of intimate partner violence should raise some sort of alarm in all of us, right? Make sure you mute your line if you haven't muted your line, just to make sure we all have a good experience. So please make sure you mute your line. Thank you. People of color in the United States experience sexual violence at disproportionately higher rates. We also know that it's very, very true. We know that there are more people of color, whether that is American Indian, whether that is Alaska Native, whether that is Black women that get raped in their lifetime compared to white women, right? We have to ask ourselves why that is, okay? We also know people of color experience domestic violence at higher rates. In a survey, we see that 48% of American Indians, Alaska Native, again, Black women, Hispanic women, report experiencing rape, physical violence, and stalking, way more than our white counterparts. Again, we must ask ourselves why that is. Why are those things happening? So I throw all these data out, not because I'm a data person. I'm really not. I'm really not. If you know me, you know I'm not. But I throw this out because I feel like we need to make it real. We need to see the numbers to truly understand that this is an issue that's going to continue to grow unless we do something about it, unless we really, really elevate, and again, elevate the voices of Black women in this space. I want to spend just a little bit of time talking to you about why I think it's so important, not just because of the skin I'm in, but because of what history has told us, right? There's a quote that says, the history of Black women spearheading the fight against sexual assault is an important reminder not only of who started and leads these movements, but also of how whitewashed content related to the movement continues to be. Here's some things you may or may not know. So Ida B. Wells, 1892, fought for racial segregation, fought for women's rights, been doing this a long time, right? Was really stuck in this space and committed to the struggle of women, even then, right? And around how we show up and being raped and kind of what that looked like. We got Mrs. Burke, who founded the Me Too movement. We know that the Me Too movement has taken on a lot of steam over the last several years. Many of us don't know that a Black woman led that charge, right? It's important to know that. Harriet Jacobs was a woman who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and made kind of this whole abolitionist conversation bigger by challenging us to think about sexual violence against slaves and Black women by their masters. So again, she was writing books, leading teachings, talking to people around why this sort of behavior was not okay, even then when we were thick in the struggle of slavery, right? Rosa Parks did more than not move. I think most people only know Rosa Parks as the person who did not move from the bus and would not give up her seat. She was so much more than that. She actually served as a sexual assault investigator for the NAACP and spent hours upon hours upon hours working to ensure that Black women that were assaulted by white men were heard and received justice. There's also one of the first known groups of women to talk about sexual assault was an African-American woman who testified, right, before Congress around just the riots of 1866. So at that time, white men were literally legally allowed, listen to what I'm saying, legally allowed to rape and enslave Black women and sexually assault them, right, legally. So this struggle that we're in, not only as Black women, as advocates, and as doing this very important work, not only are we still thick in this struggle, but we have been in this struggle for some time. And I think it's super important to provide that historical context so you understand why this work is so important. We have been doing this a very long time, right? And it's important to know some of these spaces and some of these people. When I think of Kimberly Crenshaw is the one who coined the term intersectionality. She is the reason we talk about intersectionality, a Black woman who brought this conversation to the surface around diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of people don't know that. Why is that? Why do you think a lot of the times Black women get missing or are missing from the conversation around what they led and what they contribute to this very important work? Why do you think that is, right? I want you to think about that. As I center myself in this space, in this work, here's what I think about. I think about this quote that talks about hearing Black women. So let's just sit here for just a moment. If we can hear Black women, especially poor Black, everybody benefits, right? If the benchmark becomes the treatment of poor Black women, it is a win-win for everybody. So when I talk to you about the historical context of Black women and how we've been treated and mistreated throughout history, and I tell you that those sort of things still happen, don't you think there's power in our figuring out how to elevate the voices of the people who have been in this struggle for as long as they've been in it, and yet continue to lead efforts that engage the entire country around changing the narrative around sexual trauma, violence, and racism in our country? Why aren't we more present? So here's some of the things I feel like we need to do. We need to bring awareness to the suffrages of Black women and femmes. We need to require protection and safety without discrimination. We must change the systems and the hierarchies that affect and impact us legally, socially, and environmentally. And we must change the narrative that has resulted in injustice that continues to penalize us, right? So those are the things that center me when I'm doing this work around advocacy, when I'm doing this work around Black women, when I'm doing this work around sexual violence. This is not to say that we won't elevate every single voice. This is just to say by centering Black women and their voices, we bring awareness to lifelong, literally lifelong suffrage And that will change the entire fabric of our country. Okay. Let me tell you a little bit about how this works. So we talked about Kimberly and just the intersectionality approach. Let me tell you a little bit for those who maybe don't know exactly what intersectionality is and what it looks like. Let's talk about kind of what that means. So intersectionality became popular around when, again, when Kimberly Crenshaw created it. And what it is, and I'm just trying to think of the words to explain it in a way that makes sense. It's a lens, right? For really understanding what oppression looks like. So when it was first discussed, it actually was around the lives of Black women who struggled, right? And what is known as kind of the double bind. So when I think about the double bind, what that describes is kind of the position of being discriminated both for gender and for race, right? So we fight what I call two strikes in this world and in this country. So when people forget one, they forget the other. You can't have justice without recognizing our skin, and we can't have justice without recognizing our femininity. So those two things are interconnected, and that's kind of where the intersectionality comes from, right? So when I think of intersectionality and how it works, I think about what that means for us as people to really, really grow in some of these spaces. So I think about a few things. I think about accessing programs, right? So think about how intersectionality works for Black women. We know that there aren't a lot of programs that allow us the opportunity to just walk in a facility and feel seen, right? We know, without a doubt, history has shown us that often we are misjudged, mistreated, oppressed, and racism does play a part in how we receive services. We know that. We also know that there are some issues with social and societal hierarchies, right? When you think of Black women, you think of Black women being sometimes the less paid, not being in leadership opportunities, not being in positions of authority, not being the final decision makers in a lot of spaces. Why is that? And if we're not in those spaces and we're not making those decisions, then how can we really, really impact change for the women that need it, for the Black people that need it, if we're not there to make those decisions, right? Think about advantage versus disadvantage. For some people, that's privilege versus those that aren't privileged. When we think about advantage versus disadvantage, many of us have advantages. All of us have advantages. We have an advantage of being able to be here on this call, on our computers that work, on our phones, on our tablets. There are people in our world that don't have that access. We do have advantage, right? When we think about racial advantage and how that plays out, we're looking again at systems that weren't necessarily set up for Black women and survivors. We're looking at a country that is founded on racism and white supremacy. And we're looking at all of those things and how they factor into all of those systems, right? How are those systems built for the very people they were meant to break? So we have to think about that advantage and disadvantage. We also have to think about complex trauma. So let's sit with that one for just a little bit, because that really is kind of the focus of this conversation. When we think about trauma, we're talking about some of the things I mentioned earlier, the historical way that Black women in our society have been treated for hundreds and hundreds of years, and how that does impact the way we show up today. One of the things that I do in my professional world is I am a professional career and life coach. So what that means is I literally work with people around their development, both personally and professionally, figuring out what they want to do when they grow up, right? What they want to be, and just where they want to grow in their career. So I tell that story to share that when I'm sitting across from Black people, the experience that I have as a coach is far different from their white counterparts. While some of their intricate, right? Like we all want to be successful, we all want to make more money, we all want to do well in our current fields or a new field. There are different layers to the conversation I'm having with one versus the other. Because see, with someone I'm sitting across from that might be a Black single mother who has never really had anyone pour into her, who comes from broken family lines, who doesn't really understand what it means to have a healthy family structure, who maybe has never had someone pour into her and tell her how great she is and how great she can be. We're dealing with a whole different root of concern, right? And we cannot possibly throw her into the same boardroom that we can throw someone else without dealing with some of those complex traumas. So while we create all of these systems and we create all of these things that we say will work, right? We know that this is not and cannot be a one size fits all approach. It cannot be that way, because the complex trauma that Black folks have dealt with hundreds and hundreds of years past are still relevant today. And we have to address them in order to really move forward. So I really spend a lot of time on that part, because again, that fits into this intersectionality approach and the whole concept of supporting Black women and especially supporting survivors. Unless you understand some of those complex traumas around sexual trauma, being raped by masters, being raped by fathers and brothers, and incest, and what that looks like. And while that happens in many families, we have to look at the trauma of slavery, how that impacted generations upon generations, and where was the healing in that? Do you recall after the civil rights era or after slavery ended, a bunch of psychologists or therapists getting in the room and saying, we need to talk to all the Black people? Do you recall that happening? Are there any history books or any conversations around us being healed from all the trauma we experienced? So did that trauma just pass from generation to generation to generation to generation? Absolutely. So we cannot ignore it, right? We're talking about structures where Black men were ripped from homes. We're talking about structures where Black women's bodies were used for scientific research. We're talking about structures where a woman's hair wasn't even allowed. So we need to battle those, and we need to make sure that we battle those in order to really, really understand the nature of the work that we do, right? I stayed there for a while, but I needed to. So think about that when we're thinking about kind of how survivors show up and how we do the work that we do, okay? Let's talk about some of the things that I think would be super, super important when we're talking about kind of elevating Black women not only in survivorship, but in advocacy work. I think it's super important to understand these components. We need to be educated. We need to understand what advocacy looks like. We need to know what resources are available and or create resources that support the outcomes we're looking for, We need authentic and intentional collaboration. I can only speak for Nebraska, though I've done some of this work and engaged with people nationally. It is a national problem, but let's talk about Nebraska specifically. We have groups like Survivors Rising and other really large entities in this state that are supposed to do the work of survivorship and elevating survivors. However, what happens, and I think what continues to happen, is again, we're creating these one-size-fits-all approaches that don't work for Black folks, right? And so what happens is while one leg of the work seems to be going really, really well, there's a whole missing demographic and people that aren't even having access to those programs and those opportunities. So authentic and intentional collaboration for me feels like that we are intentionally creating programs and resources that reach the very people we keep neglecting. I think that's very important. And then the last one that I put in big is healing. So I call myself a transformational coach because my goal is really to bring people from the victim space to the survivor space to the healing space. Because for some of us, we spend on survivor mode forever and we never really cross over to healing. And so it's very, very important to me, even in this work of racial oppression, that we really focus on the healing. So as I mentioned earlier, unless we deal with historical trauma, we will never really get to that place of healing because we're not in a mindset to understand why people act and react in the ways that they do. So healing is super important to me. I'm going to pause there for a second. What are your thoughts? When you think about some of this work, I'm going to try to navigate this chat without completely losing everything I got going on. Okay, here we go. I can see it. So what thoughts do you have when you think about these? Is there anything there that really resonates with you? And it's okay if you don't want to come off mute and share, but I just want to ask you, when you think of your space in this work, either as a survivor, either as someone who's doing advocacy work, I call it heart work, or someone that wants to engage in this work a little more, what are some of those areas that you feel like you can really influence? I really think, and I really believe this, that in order for you to show up the way that you need to show up, you have to find what works for you. We need somebody for everything, right? We need somebody for everything. I've talked about I'm not the data person, but I know people that are, and we need them, right? I'm not a therapist, but I know people that are, and they're wonderful. So when I think about this work, what's your influence? Where do you think you can show up and really make a difference in this space? And I really want you to think about that. And again, we're thinking about, in this context, elevating Black women in this work. Can you use your influence? Can you use your voice? Can you talk about it at your kitchen tables, right? Can you talk to your leaders? Can you change advocacy? Can you do advocacy work? We have people on this line that do amazing advocacy work. Angie's one of them. What does that look like for Black women? How can we do better? Right? I want you to think about that. See if I can get back over here. I'm trying to be jazzy and maneuver a couple different screens, and it may or may not work. Let's see. Can you still see the presentation?
Yep.
Good deal. All right, so I didn't lose it. So let's talk about what this could look like. So I thought this was very important. I actually read this in a book, in a journal, and thought, oh my gosh, this is like amazing, because it talks about the ways that you can have conversations. Now I look at this as a yes and or and approach. And here's what I mean by that. So education and advocacy looks and feels like this, right? And anyone doing this hard work or wants to look into doing this hard work or is trying to explore their own heart can think about this kind of personal way to make this work for them. So this personal experience. So let me give you an example of what this looks like. When I went through my own sexual trauma, I was very, very young. I was 12. So when I think about that and the experience, my mother who's on the line, Miss Lenore, when we think about kind of what we went through, she and I together, we think about the people who have supported us and the people who didn't. And what I mean by that, not just family, because that's a whole different conversation for a different day. What I'm talking about are the structures, right? I'm talking about, the white nuns that came into the room to support my mother and I during the most difficult time, the white doctor that pulled my mother aside and cried with her to help her, rationalize and get through that moment, the white nurses that were there and supportive of my mother. Now, how do you think that conversation or that experience could have gone if the people in that room were not supported, did not try to understand, did not ask the right questions, did not do the things to ensure that my mother, as a single Black mom, and her daughter, as a scared, sexually traumatized young Black child, did not have that rural support system? And can you imagine that our situation was rare, right? We were very blessed to receive the support that we did. What about the countless others who don't? Who go into these spaces and aren't provided the sort of care that they need based on who they are and what their needs are and the barriers they're facing culturally, right? And so when I think about this, I think about what sort of things we can do different. So you're asking the right questions. You're asking people about the support they get from their family and friends. You're asking about traditions. You're asking about, what they've been through in their culture or what identities they face or what are some of how is violence perceived in your family, right? You're digging deeper. You're not asking the 10 questions on a spreadsheet that you ask everyone that comes to you. You're asking questions specific to that particular demographic and community. That's what advocacy feels like. That's where trust is established. And so I thought this was a really neat kind of example of how this advocacy could work and look like in our communities. And not just for us, but for survivors. Can you imagine being asked, how has sexual violence played out in your home? Right? Before you even share your story. And you have an opportunity to really build that trust with someone and help them understand, here's why I was afraid to speak up before. Or here's what I've gone through generation after generation. My mother was abused, my grandmother was abused. That's why I'm here, right? You dig that deep, and it really isn't hard to do. You take that extra step to really get to know someone and their personal experience, you can literally change their lives. And to me, that's what elevating Black women in this space looks like. Don't ask me questions that don't apply to my world. Ask me questions that are really going to move me into a space of healing, right? So I really think it's important to really think about this. And as we get into the next one, there's a couple different things I want us to really focus on. So the 3 areas that I've come to kind of base my world around are accountability, justice, and healing. So when I think about accountability, it truly is exactly what it looks like, what it sounds like, right? It's being not only accountable for my own healing and growth, right? And having the resources that are available to me and taking advantage of them because they're easily accessible and I can get to them. Let's talk about that. But it's being accountable also for the way these systems are set up and knowing that they are harder and they make it harder for Black women and Black femmes, right? So we have to understand and take accountability for what that looks like. Justice really is up to the victim, the survivor, or the individual, right? Because we're not always talking about survivorship here or sexual trauma or violence. We could be talking about a whole host of things, and these 3 things still apply. When I think about the murder of George Floyd, these 3 things still apply. We needed accountability, yes. We need justice, sure. And now we need healing because it traumatized our entire nation, right? So these 3 things can literally be applied to all areas when you think of racial injustice, racial oppression, and white supremacy. We need accountability, we need justice, and we need healing. We're missing some of this when we do this work, right? We're missing a few things when we do this work. So I think we should center ourselves around these 3 areas and hope that it fuels us to change the way our systems and the oppressive nature of our systems is set up. Let's talk about accountability and justice. So those two areas that I talked about previously, here's what it could possibly look like. And again, I don't want us to look at this as a one size fits all approach. Nothing I'm saying is new. I just want you to understand how it falls into the sphere of Black lives, right? And why we need to do better, right? And so what we need to continuously think long and hard about is Black women, again, have played such a central role in leading policy and political movements, like such a central role, yet we're still missed from every table, right? And we're talking about from like the earliest days of the nation to like today's struggles. Representation and equality have always been in our forefront. Yet, again, we're missing from a lot of these conversations. Why is that? There's a term that we use in Survivors Rising, and I think we coined it possibly from somewhere else, but it's there should be nothing for us without us, right? Why is that not applied for Black women? You know, as the nation becomes like increasingly diverse, our goal is to make sure that we're in every space, right? So policymakers have a responsibility to truly listen and bring in and embrace Black women's voices, a responsibility, right? Lawmakers have to respond with thoughtful policy and solutions that are more oriented to what will serve us as Black women and create opportunities for Black voices to be heard. We need to be heard on state and national levels. Everything that I listed here was created, led, and has been continuously led by Black women. The desegregation of schools, Voting Rights Act, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, the Say Her Name movement, all Black women, Black femmes, right? So we really need to make sure that we are being intentional about what we're saying when we say things like Black Lives Matter. Women have to be a part of that discussion, right? Here's the thing, Black women have this high rate of voting, which reflect one way in which we invest in our communities. If you look at the numbers year over year, Black women show up, right? And so another way accountability and justice matter is recognizing and crediting the work that's being done and has been done by Black women. Centering them in this work does eliminate racial and gender disparities. It's just what we can do. Creating equitable structures will change the way this world is set up. Eliminating racial and gender disparities is one of the things I'm going to repeat that will help Black women show up in these spaces, right? And let's talk about healing a little bit. What that looks like to me is understanding the barriers. I mentioned earlier, had it not been for some of the social workers, doctors, and others that were conscious of my barriers and who I was as a young Black girl showing up in that office, it could have completely changed the course of my world. So understanding barriers, identity, legacy trauma, what that means, recognizing and wanting to understand how we react and act as a result is what will create space and elevate kind of who we are. So it isn't about making excuses. It's about making space, creating space, elevating the voices, and then listening to the voices. Did you know Black women are imprisoned at higher rates than most everyone and double the rate of white women? Did you know that? Why is that? For some, they'll say, well, Black women might be out there creating more crimes. And, you know, we might get into that conversation about Black on Black violence and what that looks like. Not here today. We'll save that for another space. But what we're talking about today is that Black women are significantly overrepresented in state and federal prisons, have a high likelihood of being incarcerated for drug use, highly trafficked starting at young ages. We have to ask ourselves why that is and what sort of healing our systems need to do to ensure this doesn't keep happening, right?
Candy?
This leads Black, go ahead, yeah.
Hi, it's Karen. I just wanted to ask you a question about justice, because some people would say that we can't have justice or fight for justice within an oppressive white supremacist system, that the system itself is so broken that trying to get justice within it isn't possible, and that the system has to be completely overhauled or thrown out and recreated. And I was just curious if you've thought about that, had conversations about that.
Mm-hmm. I have thought about it. And what I think we have to understand is that part of the racial system, the justice system, and how it's set up was really based around those so-called like tough on crime policies, right? Some of us remember some of that from like certain eras, where they supposedly got tougher on crime, which led to harsher sentences, which put people in jail for selling marijuana, where now marijuana is being legalized in most states, right? And most of those impacted Black folks. So while I agree that we do need to kind of think about overhauling the system, the problem with that is this: we're not there. And what I mean we is, I mean Black men, Black women, Black folks, queer, trans individuals, femmes are not in those systems. We're not there at those leadership levels. So until we start to utilize the allyship of our white counterparts who are, to pull us into those spaces, you're right, nothing will change. We can do the work, we can hit the streets, we can protest, we can do all the things, we can vote, right? Those are things we can do. But in order to really change the way these systems are set up, we do need to get more Black judges in there. We need more Black lawyers. We need more Black public defenders. We need more Black prosecutors. We need folks that understand the voices of Black folks. And we can't continue to pull away from the system as opposed to getting in the system. One of my favorite things that Malcolm X did stand for, and Martin Luther King as well, was the idea of we don't run from a situation by saying we're not welcome there, we're going to go over here. No, what we say is we are welcome wherever we choose to be. And so my encouragement to anyone who's struggling with what that could look like, especially as a Black person, is if you have a desire, or I'm going to say a person of color, because I think we need all those voices at the table. If you are a person of color or an ally that recognizes the importance of elevating Black folks, you need to be where those decisions are made. And you need to elevate Black voices into those spaces. What I think, Karen, and that's a great question, what I think in terms of the system and us saying we need to overhaul it, again, I agree with that. But we cannot do that until we're in those spaces where those decisions are made, point blank, period. You know, as long as the same power structures exist, the same outcomes will happen. We'll move the needle just a little bit. You know, the George Floyd verdict is an example of that. But what it took, look at what it took, you know? And so I feel like we need to really change the narrative. Again, that's on there in terms of healing around how this looks. I actually was having a conversation with someone around just Black folks in corporate, a little off subject, but will illustrate the point. You know, a lot of people that I interact with are like, you know, as a Black person, corporations are hard. It's hard to be in corporate spaces, not feel recognized, not feel seen. I tell people all the time, I'm in a corporate space, like my full-time job is in corporate America, and I've been in corporate America a long time. I have decided I belong there. And if I want to see changes in that system, as opposed to running from that system, then I'm going to be the one to make those changes. I'm going to stay put until I'm called to do something else. I belong where I belong. And so I think we need to change that narrative around feeling like we're not supposed to be somewhere and go wherever we want, and then kick the door down and make the changes, right? So the other thing I want to talk about really quickly here is why all of this is important. So when we think about Black women and Black femmes and why these structures are set up to really hurt us, policymakers have the opportunity to like introduce and really advocate for policies that increase opportunities for Black women and Black survivors. That's, you know, helping us get into jobs that make, you know, care accessible for our children and healthcare accessible. And we talk about childcare, reproductive rights. Those are all things that we actually have up right now, bills being passed to tackle discrimination and to tackle racial, you know, oppression, and to tackle sexism and all those other isms that make it hard for us. So again, we have to do the work, and sometimes policy and legislature is it. Other times it's just creating space right where you are. And so I want you to keep that in mind. So the last thing I want to do here, and then we'll set ourselves up for a little time. How much time we got, Karen? When are we done today?
Sorry, you've got until 10:45, so you've got plenty.
Perfect. So we got plenty of time.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so one of the things I want to do, and I know it's not a whole lot of us on this call, but I do want to have a little bit of engagement for those that wish to talk a little bit about why it's important to believe survivors and kind of what that means. So let me give you a little background around that. So we talk about survivors and sexual assault. What we're saying is that survivors deserve to be heard. What I'm saying is that Black women are not heard. And so when I talk about this work, I talk about supporting, believing, loving, and caring for survivors. And that really is about believing in accountability, justice, and healing, as I mentioned. So there's a quote that says, I'll read it here. Let me pull it up. That phrase, and there's a broader version. So believe survivors are reactions to a long history in which women and others who reported sexual misconduct were dismissed, smeared, shamed, or ignored. The call to believe survivors is a recognition that we live in a society with a pervasive rape culture in which marginalized communities are more likely to be harmed than folks who are in the majority. Again, that's really where that phrase was coined. It's been taken and tainted a little bit, but that's really kind of how that survivor mentality started. It was intended to represent and elevate underrepresented populations. Again, another thing that a lot of us don't know, because a lot of society takes those phrases or those movements and turns them into something that completely misses the point and the relevance, right? So we really have to get intentional about, what this means and what this means for all of us. So this is the part where I ask for a little bit of engagement. We don't have to do a lot, but I want you to think about kind of some of the spaces, your own personal experiences, where you feel, you can elevate the voices of Black women. I want to talk about that a little bit. I want to get your thoughts around what that means. And then we can talk about, Karen, if you wish, kind of how Survivors Rising is doing that and some of the things that we're doing to ensure elevating Black women happens. So I'm gonna stop sharing just for a second so I can be present. And I want to just have a conversation. When you think about elevating the voices of Black women, what does that mean? I'm going to look back through some of these comments on this chat too, but please feel free to chime in.
Yeah, this is Jade speaking.
Hi,
My
Jade.
video. Hi. I'm in the car, so I don't want to put on my video, but I think about advocacy and sponsorship and what does that look like in marrying the two, and sponsorship and mentorship. I think about when I'm not in the room, who's speaking for me, and what does that look like, and how is my voice being channeled through someone else who may have the tools to get me somewhere, get her somewhere, and get everybody somewhere, or more elevated in the conversation. And I think it also, for me, channeling my, what does it mean to be a survivor, but then going to be a healer as well, and being able to speak in my voice as a survivor and then healership along the way. And does that mean, do I have to be necessarily, can I be a survivor and healing at the same time in order to elevate and heal and help other people be a survivor too? How do I live in both spaces, and ultimately elevating myself and then elevating other folks that may share similar traumas or also feel affected by a certain trauma, especially in the Black community. I'm in my mid-20s, and I think about some of my friends who have normalized trauma and relationship trauma, and what we see on social media and popular media today too. So it's probably good I was muted during your chat, because I was just hollering, screaming, agreeing all the way. When I heard you say it was legal to, it wasn't against the law to harm Black women. So if it's legal to do that and it's normalized in our homes and outside of our homes, how does that normalize within our communities? And I think we have to really look at the bigger picture to understand, the person that it was involved in domestic violence and relationship domestic violence, he was also a biracial man. He was Black and Dominican. So I think about it was normalized in his communities to see people that look like him treat women that look like me the same way he treated me. So, oh man, I don't know. This is just, I just think about what sponsorship looks like inside of advocacy. So I could go on forever, but I'm going to go back on mute.
No, you're good. And please keep chiming in. I really think, thank you so much for that, Jade. Everything you said resonated. Everything you said, I felt. And here's what's important about conversations like this. Again, I don't like to lecture. What I like to do is engage in hard work. And I think anything that you can share and talk about that brings you into this space of what we're trying to accomplish will make it real for you, right? And then you want to go out and do the things as opposed to just having a conversation, right? So yeah, I agree, Jade, that was amazing. And another thing I'll add is, before I open it back up to everyone, is when you talk about sponsorship and advocacy, they are two different things, right? Because we have a lot of people doing advocacy work. Yet it is super important to bring the voices into the conversation. That's what sponsorship looks and feels like, that can talk about their own lived experiences and how this shows up in their communities, right? It's super important. Again, you can't possibly have a conversation to change the lives of all victims without including the voices of all victims. There's no way to do it, right? Because you're only going to talk to that section of the population that's in the space. So I agree. It's super important for us all to continue these conversations. Angie, I see you came on camera. You want to chime in? Angie is our chair on Survivors Rising that handles a lot of the advocacy work, has been super instrumental in that space, and will be speaking later on today. So I encourage you to join her session. Angie, you want to chime in?
Yeah, so I didn't want to take up a lot of space just because I am speaking for an hour, but one of the ways that we try, my husband and I, we try to be very conscious about our privilege. And so when my husband is asked to speak, he asks who else is on this panel. And if there's other, white, male, if there's no women, he will back out and say, no, we need better representation on these panels. He's very aware of the perception. And so he will back out of speaking gigs if there's a lack of representation. And when I was asked if I had any interest of coming back and serving on the board of Survivors Rising, I was very intentional when I said, I'm not interested if there's other demographics that need to be represented. I don't need to be there. I can still do my advocacy work. We need to make sure that we are setting up a board that is representative of our community and being very intentional about that. So I think trying to elevate everyone's voice is super important. And it's okay for those of us with privilege to step back and make sure that there's space for everyone to be represented. And that's one of those things that we have to be very intentional. And I know that it throws off those in other generations to say, no, you deserve that space. And I'm like, but do I? And questioning that and making sure that we're very aware of representation and making sure that we are leaving space for those that should have those spots, because it doesn't need to be all old white men. Like, just want to be very clear. So I'll just call that out. And so I'll step back. I'll see everybody soon.
Me come off mute. Thank you, Angie. No, that's perfect. And you're right. Like, I think about, and so the other thing I want to raise up in this space too, is when we're talking about Black women in advocacy work, Black femmes in advocacy work, it is not to dismiss anyone. And I think sometimes when we talk about elevating of anything, we get what I call a defense mechanism, or a power imbalance of power makes people feel threatened. One of the things you can I can almost assure you of, and I want you to really think about this. When you elevate Black women, especially poor Black women, here's what you get. You get changed systems. You get desegregation. You get voting rights. You get women's rights. You get poverty lines increased. You get housing structures changed. So I'm throwing out just some of the stuff at the top of my head that Black women have been instrumental with, that we all benefit from. So here's the thing: when you think about cultural trauma and you think about how Black women have operated, we are definitely here's what I want you to think about. When Black women were slaves, and if we were provided the opportunity to work in the master's house, what did we do? We took care of the master's babies. We made sure the master's kids were fed. We made sure the women were clothed and bathed. We took care of the home, the structure. We literally kept households running, right? And so it's innate. And that's why you hear a lot of it's in us to care, right? And again, think of historical trauma and how that shows up. We have always been expected to care about everyone long before we put ourselves first. And again, that is not just me talking, that is historical trauma, right? And so with that, we don't go into any of these justice or social justice spaces with self in mind. What we go into these spaces thinking is that if I can make it better for me, I guarantee you I can make it better for everybody else. And I think that's something that we all need to understand and wrap our minds around. This is not an elevation of one versus the other. This is by elevating one, you elevate everybody else. If you think about equality, I always think about the boxes. So there's this picture, I wish I had it, but if you look up the equality picture, I want you to think of this. So there's a crate. This crate's at this level, this crate's at this level, and there's another crate at this level. So you have 3 different crates, right? And you have a fence, right? And so, you know, the person that's on this top crate can see over that fence, right? Even though you gave all three of them crates, the other two are shorter and cannot see over that fence. That's kind of what equality in this work looks like. You can have the fence, right? You can hand us over whatever you want to hand us, but if we don't have the right barriers removed and systems in place, we still can't see over the fence. And so it doesn't make it easier for us by making it easier for you. But if you lower the fence or increase the crates, right? If we all have equal crates, then we can all see over that same fence and get the same benefit. So I think what people miss in this work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and elevating Black voices is concern that power will shift. Power will not shift. Power will be equalized, which will change the entire game of this nation. So it's very, very important that we look at this work in that way. So as I think about Amen daughter, my mother Lenora is on the call. Shout out to moms that always pump you up. So the other thing I want to bring up too is and ask out for the group is when you think about, equity versus equality, when you think about survivors and the survivor lens and the survivor work, what are one of the things or some of the areas you feel that Black women should or aren't as fairly represented? And I want to ask that question honestly. When you think about this and you go in, and maybe Angie, feel free to chime in again. I know you're speaking, so I want you to wear yourself out, but I know you are super engaged in this space. When you think about some of this work and how Black women can be more engaged and involved in this work, what are some of the spaces you feel like we're missing? Does anyone have any thoughts around that?
I know I'm going to talk about the legislature
Go
in a
ahead.
little bit, but holy smokes, can we use more help from Black women standing in the rotunda, being present and being elected as our state senators and stepping up into those positions? And so that would be super important. And I would cheer to have more help in that area.
And so I wanted to lift that up. Jay, go ahead. I see you came off mute. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say, echoing from what Angie said, just seeing a familiar face and hearing a familiar voice. Does that necessarily mean that person looks like me 100%? No, but she may come from a similar background, or she may, understand a little bit or be able to sort of relate, or I can relate to her story.
Mhm.
So just seeing someone that I can find some similarity in is important.
Absolutely. Jade, you raised such a great point. I mentioned earlier how I had white allies in the space of my trauma that really kind of helped shape how I view race and race relations. I also had several Black women still in the end that have been my backbone and my strength, including my dear mom. But just the Black women that have poured into me have been instrumental because they look like me, they could relate to me, they understood me. I think about one person in particular when I was going through probably the heaviest of the trauma. My mother and I met a Black social worker who just got it, right? Who just could sit and talk with us and relate with us in a real way, understood our background, understood the things we were experiencing. And I'll never forget her and the way she made me feel in that moment, especially going through trauma. So again, I raised this point around elevating Black women because yes, we are misrepresented and sometimes not present in the spaces we need to be in. We need to get there, and we need to be unafraid to get there and use our voices to get us there. That does not mean I'm not accepted in corporate, I'm gonna go find another job, right? That means, no, I'm going to stay and I'm going to be accepted. I'm gonna move myself into any positions I can to influence change, whether that's in nonprofit, survivorship, entrepreneurial, legislator, advocacy. We belong everywhere. And we need to really change that narrative around assuming we don't and we can't be. Because I'm gonna tell y'all now, this is the time. While the fire's hot, this is the time. And I don't mean that to be crass. What I'm saying is we recognize that there are a lot of people who don't want to look bad right now. And we need to capitalize on that. And that means any spaces that we can get in, if it makes sense to us in our careers and it makes sense in our voices, we need to get there now. This is the time. This is the time to do that. So I really encourage you to elevate your voices in any space you feel comfortable. And as an ally, you can do the same. Bring your people of color along, and help them elevate, because I promise you, once they're elevated, you're elevated. Promise you that. What else? Any other thoughts? I know we're at time. I don't have to go all the way to time. I can give you a few minutes back if you wish, but what other thoughts do you have around some of this work and how it looks? Any other thoughts?
Candy, I was wondering, since we're kind of talking about this, I think a lot
Yep.
about imposter syndrome. And when I'm talking about trying to raise up other women and trying to raise up everyone that should be represented at the CEO, C-level or elected office, there's a lot of imposter syndrome when it comes to women and underrepresented minorities. And I just, can you speak to that just a little bit and help, you know, because I like to like knock some people around if I can and be like, no, you belong. And I just, and so anyone that knows me knows that I will ask you to run for something, no matter who you are, no matter your background, no matter what, you belong and you need to belong in elected office. We need you, but
Yeah. I'm going to, and I welcome anyone to step into the space if you want to share, again, conversational. When I think about imposter syndrome personally and what that is, so first let's talk about what it is. So imposter syndrome truly is the way people believe they should show up. Some people call it the mask, you know, walking into a room feeling like you don't belong, or that, you know, no one here is like you. You know, feeling like you don't have a voice, like you're not represented. Sometimes for some of us, especially those of us who've been through trauma, it can look like triggers, right? We will be quick to get defensive or quick to assume that someone's, you know, out to harm us because we've been harmed, you know? And so imposter syndrome can look like a bunch of different things. And I actually say it looks like a bunch of different feelings. But here's some of the things that you can do. When I talk about elevating Black women and elevating ourselves and our allyship in any space that we choose to be in, it really is about being comfortable about talking about why you're showing up in the ways that you are. So let me give you an example. I'm kind of rambling, but let me give you an example of that. I can only use myself as an example. There are times when my trauma triggers me to feel like I have to be at everything and do all the things in order to be recognized, or in order for people to understand my heart. And I feel the need to do it because I just want to show up. And while my intentions are pure, that leads to hella burnout. Right. And so what happens with me is that is a level and a form of imposter syndrome. So I wanted to give people kind of that definition, because I think people think of it in race and race relations, but really imposter syndrome can show up in all kinds of ways. So that is something you're going to have to personally and intentionally work on within yourself. Trusting people is a form of imposter syndrome, right? Assuming everyone's out to hurt you and assuming people can't love or treat you. That is your issue because you deserve it. So if you're not getting it, that's something you have to figure out and really work on. Because listen, as I know, the world doesn't know it's a thing, right? But how we show up, you teach people how to treat you, right? So if you want to be treated in ways that are important to you, it is very important that you set that tone, that you set that stage. And so there is truth to fake it till you make it. There is definite truth to that. And what that means in my mind is sometimes I just have to show up and allow everything within me that's natural and in my soul and my heart to just come out, right? And if I'm not feeling it, I'm not feeling it, and I can say that. I don't know if that completely answers the question, but where I'm going with it is imposter syndrome is something that you personally have to attack and you have to address almost every day. Because if you truly, but you have to have a vision around what you want to do and how you see yourself, and then you constantly gear yourself towards that. So for me, survivors, Black women, elevating, understanding, and healing are super important and imperative to me. So I show up to do the work in that space. And I don't worry about who thinks I shouldn't be there because I know I belong, right? I know I do. That's not to say I don't have my moments, but you have to do the work.
And I wanted to add, Candy, for a second about white allies like myself. Part of our responsibility is to break through, is to use our white privilege to break through some of the white fragility and possessiveness that white folks in this nonprofit and corporate sectors have, and uplift and amplify the voices of our colleagues who and demonstrate for our white colleagues that Black women survivors belong here and speak up for you. We're so proud to have you as the chair of the board of Survivors Rising, and to have you in that place where you can show your leadership to the world. But we need more of that. And some of that we're going to have to make space for as white folks, and to bring new people in and to say, this is really important that that we hear the voices of Black women and Black women survivors in particular.
Mhm. I agree. And I think to add on to that, you raised such good points, both Angie and Karen. To add on to that, it's about recognizing, a lot of what we think about ourselves, imposter syndrome and some of those other terms, are based on white supremacy. And again, I know people don't want to hear that. And I know it's hard to hear, but understand, none of us were meant to suffer, struggle, and hurt. But it's been ingrained in us and it's been taught. And so we literally go into the world with that sort of heavy burden of having to fight our way through all things. And that's not the way we're supposed to be. That's not why we're here. And so I think it's also important that we develop a new script, change the narrative, right? We have the right to show up in these spaces authentically. We have the right to lean on one another and trust each other in these spaces authentically. And our voices need to be authentic as well. And there's no reason why we can't change all the things that we've been taught, and develop I call it write the rules, right? We need to write our own rules. Write the rules, RIGHT, and write the rules, WRIGHT, or WRITE. Ooh, I can't spell. See? So both. We need to do both. We need to write the rules and we need to write the rules. We need to rewrite them because we can. We're in a position to do that. Tracy, I see you came off camera. Did you want to speak or were you just hanging out with us?
I'm just hanging out.
Okay. What other thoughts do you have? I know we only have about 5 minutes and I've enjoyed my time with you so much, but I want to make sure we make space for you to get a break in before you head to your next one. And again, I'll answer any questions you have in this moment. Any questions you have around the information that's shared, or any final thoughts you have around elevating Black women in survivorship and advocacy? If not, no worries. I will close us out. Again, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. I always feel like the conversation around Black women in advocacy is so very, very loaded that there's no way for me to address all the things in an hour. But what I do is make myself available to you to continue the conversation and to continue doing this work. If there's something that you'd like to talk about offline, it's not always the space to do it in front of others. So if there is something you'd like to talk about offline, I will make myself available. I'll put my email address in the chat. I encourage you to reach out to me. Let's talk about it. I encourage you to get involved with Survivors Rising if you have a desire to kind of just really get into this work around advocacy, elevating Black women, survivorship, all the things. I encourage you to get involved. We're ready. We're doing the work. It's heavy work, but I think we're all equipped to do it. So again, thank you for sharing time and space with me today. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, Candy. Woohoo! And so we're going to take about a 15-minute break. At 11 o'clock, we'll be coming back, and Angie Lauritsen is going to be doing a workshop introducing us to legislative advocacy, and we're very excited about that. I put our Survivors Rising info@gmail.com email in the chat, so you can reach out to us anytime. So we're just going to take a little bit of a break here. If you're going to stay for Angie's workshop, you can just stop your video and mute yourself until about 11, and we'll be back. So excited. Thank you.